Joining us now is General David Petraeus. He is the former CIA director and CENTCOM commander. He's led troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan. General, thank you so much. You have tremendous experience. We're grateful to have you here. Iran's deputy foreign minister just told me that the Iranians were willing to make a deal to give up its highly enriched uranium. Do you believe they were serious?
Well, perhaps to give it up, but not to give up the enrichment process overall. And I think the administration really was insistent on that, and I think rightly so. Iran is not in a position to stretch out these kinds of negotiations. They really, at some point, are going to have to accept what is dictated to them in large measure, given the outcome of what this war will be. Whether or not there is a regime change, all of the other objectives are going to be achieved, and there will be conditions set for regime change, as the president has noted. Whether or not there are opposition forces that could rise up, I think, is very much in question.
We've been hearing a really optimistic narrative coming from the Pentagon and from the White House. CENTCOM says they're ahead of their game plan. Secretary Hegseth says we're winning this war. The president has described sort of this rosy picture, sinking Iran's Navy, knocking out their Air Force, their air detection systems. But this is war. Is it that simple?
Well, it's very, very complex. And I actually think that the chairman in particular would be very quick to note how complex this is. But there's no question that we are achieving tremendous progress in taking down regime leaders, degrading regime forces, reducing the number of missile launchers, missiles, and even the manufacturing facilities. Same for drones, although that is a challenge. And the missile math, as Ravi mentioned in the previous segment, is important to keep an eye on. That could be something that could be of concern as this goes along. Degrading the Navy, well over a dozen of the Iranian ships have been sunk, including one apparently off the coast of India by a U.S. submarine, and then going after whatever remnants might be left of the nuclear program from the 12-day war in which they were heavily damaged or destroyed, setting the program back probably a couple of years. But the International Atomic Energy Agency statement a few days ago, just before the war started, that mentioned that there may be a 60% enriched uranium stockpile underneath the Esfahan facility, which was heavily damaged. I suspect we're going to revisit that and pile drive the massive ordnance penetrators into that to make sure that that does not survive. The real question, of course, is how it ends. Supposedly there have been feelers put out already by the Iranians. Those aren't confirmed.
In fact, the Iranians who I spoke to denied that there had been any kind of outreach to the U.S. when it comes to getting back to the negotiating table.
Yeah, and not surprising. Again, the tone so far from them has been one of defiance. And of course, what we should be watching in particular is what will be the character of the next supreme leader. The Assembly of Experts tried to meet yesterday. That meeting was interrupted by Israeli bombs, apparently. But will the next supreme leader demonstrate a degree of pragmatism that has not been a hallmark of the first two supreme leaders who have been very hardline ideologues and who have, of course, totally mismanaged the economy of a country with the second largest natural gas reserves, third largest oil reserves, an educated population that should be an energy superpower and more, but instead is in poverty at home and isolated abroad. So we'll see what does come out of that. And then also, obviously, watch whether or not there can be some opposition force. There are reports of the CIA apparently arming Kurds.
Right.
That's a minority in Iran, along with the Azeris and the Turkmen and Sunnis and so forth.
Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I think supporting those who want to overthrow the regime and have some organizational structure and leaders and so forth is a very good idea. But you don't see that at scale. Keep in mind that the regime, if you total it all up, has somewhere around 1 million men under arms who are willing to be very brutal, as they demonstrated in putting down the demonstrations, killing probably tens of thousands of Iranians and imprisoning tens of thousands more. And the problem is there's no organized opposition, no leader that has stood out. We've talked about the Shah's son and so forth. In fact, I just met him in Munich and talked about his plan that he's laid out for this. that name is
What
symbolic.
did you learn
I
about
don't
his
think
plan?
Well, he's actually published a plan. It's publicly out there. It's a transition plan. If the regime is brought down, here's what we should do. It's very general in nature, but it is at least something that is out there. The question is, what role can he play? Can he get on the ground? Can he be the Ahmad Shah Massoud in the Panjshir Valley, as in Afghanistan, the leader of the Northern Alliance, terribly, tragically assassinated right before we went in and used the Northern Alliance as the ground force with our air power to topple the Taliban. I don't see that probability right now. And I think what the administration will say is, look, we achieved all of our objectives relative to the nuclear program, missiles, drones, naval capabilities, regime force degradation, and so on. But no one stepped up. And so, there we are. But that does bear careful watching, as does, again, the missile math. We have lots of bombs that we can drop on Iran, and the Secretary is right to point out that as we have achieved, at the very least, local air superiority, and probably broader than that over time, then we can bring in the really heavy hitters. So you don't have to just have the stealth B-2 bombers and F-35 stealth fighter bombers. Now you can bring on the B-1 bombers, even the B-52s have been in action, and the payloads that they carry are enormous. So the numbers of strikes is just going to continue. The question is, can we very rapidly degrade the missile and drone capabilities, because that has obviously been what they've used to go after our assets, and also foolishly after the Gulf state civilian assets.
And in general, I think one of the biggest questions on many minds at this point is, what is the end game? When is there going to be an obvious moment where we can look at it and say objectively, this mission was successful and it's time for the U.S. to pull back? Hegseth says when it's over, it'll be over. And he's adamant there will not be a forever war. You obviously have experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you have confidence that this is not going to lead to a forever war? Are the actions we've seen so far going to do that?
I think that it's pretty obvious that the members of the administration have taken from Iraq and Afghanistan a recognition that getting into a war on the ground is not something advisable. At the most, what we should be doing is helping to arm, train, equip, enable others to do that if we can find them. And it would be very significant if you saw a senior leader in the regime forces, perhaps coming out of the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines, rather than the Revolutionary Guards Corps, which are, after all, a regime survival force. If that could happen, that would be very significant. But even though I think the president rightly did not rule out the possibility of ground forces, I don't think a president should ever rule out anything. And I think some of his predecessors have unnecessarily done that over time. Don't tell the enemy what we will not do. At least have them think that there's a possibility of it. And of course, it may be that we might put some very, very select boots and others sneakers on the ground to enable some of the opposition activities. But I would think that it would be very much limited to that. Look, I think that they have a number of metrics that they will use to evaluate whether they have achieved their objectives against the target sets that I mentioned. And at a certain point in time, when they believe that that has happened and they've done enough damage to these different target sets, they'll do an assessment and perhaps declare that we have achieved what we set out to do, even if the overall objective that featured in President Trump's early remarks, as you'll recall, but then has been qualified since then about regime change, now will set the conditions for political transition. Even if that may not be fully achieved, I think that's when there will be an assessment. Keep in mind also, there's a real imperative to reopen the freedom of navigation in the Gulf and through the Strait of Hormuz. There have been several ships that have been hit in the vicinity of that area. If we do end up escorting, as we have done before, the tanker wars back in the 1980s, it'll take time to set that up, to also work out the mechanics of the insurance support scheme that he announced yesterday as well. That's critical because the longer this goes, the 20% of the crude oil and 20% of the LNG that comes out of the Gulf obviously is not being provided to the world market. So a lot of different dynamics here, I think, on which to focus. But my sense is they're making very, very good progress against those various target sets, and that we are able now, because of the very substantial reduction of air and missile defenses in Iran, able to operate much more freely. That doesn't mean that there can't be an aircraft brought down. It doesn't mean there's not a maintenance problem over top of Iran. We're all praying that that will not happen and there won't be a pilot being dragged through the streets of Tehran. But so far, the professionalism, the expertise of the U.S. and Israeli air forces has been nothing short of breathtaking.